The maid cursed the royal family after their cruel betrayal. What happened next shocked everyone. There's a letter that no historian in Thailand wanted to discuss publicly for decades. It was written in the early 20th century by a young woman who had no power, no status, and no voice within the palace walls that imprisoned her. By the time anyone took the letter seriously, 3 members of one of Asia's most prominent royal dynasties had died under circumstances that even palace officials could not cleanly explain. What began as a story of a servant became something that disturbed investigators, archivists, and scholars long after the events had passed. This is not a story about superstition. It is a story about what happens when power goes entirely unchecked and what it leaves behind. The Grand Palace in Bangkok has stood since 1782. Millions of people walk through its outer courtyards every year and see the temples, the gilded rooftops, the meticulous gardens. What they almost never see are the interior structures, the residential wings, the servant corridors, the rooms that were once filled not with tourists, but with human beings who were legally considered property of the crown. In the Siamese royal court of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a system called the Inner Palace governed the lives of hundreds of women. They cooked, they cleaned, they served, they raised children, and they were not permitted to leave. That system produced a story that the palace never wished to tell. The story of Choi. Her full name does not appear cleanly in any single official record. In various documents, she is listed simply as Choi, a common given name among commoner women of the era. She was likely born sometime in the 1880s in a region outside Bangkok, brought into the Inner Palace as a young girl. As was common practice for families who served the court, her family would have considered it an honor, an elevation. The palace would have represented security, proximity to the divine, a life structured by ritual and duty. What it actually represented for the women inside was an existence shaped by absolute obedience, social invisibility, and total dependency on the will of those above them. Choi had no reason to expect her story would differ from any other. For a long time, it did not. The Nongharm, or Forbidden Women, was a formal designation for the system that governed life inside the Inner Palace. At its peak, during the reign of Rama V, known internationally as King Chulalongkorn, the Inner Palace housed an estimated 3,000 women. They ranged from royal consorts and minor wives to ladies-in-waiting, servants, cooks, and guards. There were female police officers within the Inner Palace, women who enforced its rules and punishments. What the system created, functionally, was a sealed world. Men, with very few ceremonial exceptions, were not permitted to enter. The women inside could not leave without explicit royal permission. Children born within could be recognized by the crown or ignored entirely, depending on the father's will. The hierarchy within the Inner Palace was severe, and the distance between its highest and lowest occupants was nearly impossible to cross. For servants like Choi, daily life inside the Inner Palace was a cycle of invisible labor. Before dawn, fires were lit in the kitchen complexes. Rice was washed and set to cook. Fruit was arranged on lacquer trays according to specific court protocols. The wrong arrangement could draw punishment. Floors were swept in particular direction. Incense was lit at prescribed times, and every movement to the palace required awareness of rank. To walk in the presence of someone of higher status without lowering oneself appropriately was considered disrespect. To make eye contact without permission could carry consequences. The women enforcing these rules were not cruel by nature. They were products of system. They had been shaped by the same rules they now upheld. Choi understood this. For years, she navigated it without incident. But her compliance, it turned out, had a limit. The precise nature of the wrong done to Choi is not described uniformly across the historical accounts that reference her. What the accounts agree on is a category of the harm. She was punished for something she did not do. The accusation, which scholars who have examined the fragmentary records describe as almost certainly fabricated, involved the theft of a royal object, possibly a piece of jewelry or a ceremonial item. The punishment for theft within the Inner Palace was not subtle, depending on the severity and the accuser's rank. It could involve physical punishment, extended confinement, or complete social excommunication within the palace community. What makes Choi's case distinct is not only the punishment itself, but the consensus, expressed in documents that survived, that the accusation came from someone far above her, and that no one within the palace structure was willing or able to contest it. One of the defining features of injustice within closed institutional systems is that there is no external witness. Inside the inner palace, there was no appeal to outside authority. There was no journalist, no magistrate, no family member who could arrive and demand explanation. Choi's family, it even knew what was happening to her, had no mechanism for intervention. What existed within the palace was a chain of authority that began with the crown and descended through layers of court hierarchy, each layer dependent on the one above it for its own survival. In such a system, truth, in the way that people outside such structures might understand it, holds almost no weight. What matters is rank. What matters is whose account carries authority. Choi had no rank. Her account carried none. And so the punishment proceeded, as punishments in such systems always do, efficiently and without ceremony. The letter that Choi wrote, or that was written on her behalf, as some accounts suggest she may have dictated, was not discovered immediately. It surfaced, according to Thai historians who have referenced it in academic contexts, during a period of archival, reviewed decades after her death. The letter is not long. Its language, by accounts of those who have read it, is not dramatic or hysterical. It is described as deliberate, measured. It describes what was done to her, the names or titles of those responsible, and it closes with what the writer of the letter calls a request, directed not to any human authority, but outward, to forces she believed operated beyond the palace walls and beyond the reach of rank. Whether you interpret that closing as prayer, as curse, or as the final act of someone with nothing left to lose depends entirely on what you bring to the reading. To understand why the letter disturbed the people who found it, it is necessary to understand the weight that cursing carries within Thai spiritual culture. This is not a fringe belief or a relic from an uneducated past. Across Thai society, at every level of wealth and education, there exists a deeply held understanding that the spoken or written words of someone who has been wronged carry a particular kind of power. The phrase that translates most closely is accumulated harm returning. The spiritual logic is precise. Injustice does not disappear when the powerful ignore it. It accumulates. And if the person wronged calls on that accumulation with clarity and without ego, not from hatred, but from a claim to justice, the weight of what was done can travel through time in ways that no rank or wealth can deflect. Choi appears to have known this, and she used it with intention. The first death that would eventually be connected, at least in the accounts of those who believe in the letter's significance, came within a decade of Choi's punishment. It was a member of the royal household, young, with no documented illness, whose death was recorded officially as sudden and unexplained. At the time, it was mourned as a tragedy without context. Funerals within the Thai royal family during this period were extraordinarily elaborate affairs. Days of ceremony, monks chanting in rotation, the palace draped in white and gold. The public was informed only of the loss, never of the circumstances. Within the palace, however, there were whispers. There are always whispers in closed systems. And some of those whispers, years later, would be written down by people who had no interest in superstition. People who were simply trying to account for a pattern they could not otherwise explain. The second death came several years later. Again, the official record was brief. Again, the circumstances were described in language that seemed to close down inquiry rather than open it. What the researchers who later examined these records noted was not necessarily that the deaths were supernatural in origin. Most were careful to avoid that claim. What they noted was a consistency of the silence around them. In well-documented royal families, deaths generate paperwork. They generate correspondence between officials, between physicians, between members of the household staff who were present. In these cases, the paper trail was conspicuously thin. Documents that should have existed seemed not to, and in at least one instance, a scholar found a reference to documents that had been removed from an archival collection at some point after they were originally filed. Someone had been careful. That carefulness, in its own way, told a story. By the time the third death occurred, and the timeline here spans roughly 20 to 30 years from Choi's punishment, placing these events across the late Siamese royal period, the pattern had become impossible for those inside the palace to entirely ignore. 3 members of the royal household, none elderly, none with documented terminal illness. Each dead under circumstances the official record described in ways that felt deliberately vague. The people who connected these deaths to Choi were not outsiders. They were palace insiders, women who had known Choi, who had witnessed what was done to her, and who had, in some cases, tried to raise objections at the time and been silenced. Their accounts, passed down through oral tradition within certain Thai families, were eventually recorded by researchers interested not in the supernatural element, but in the institutional history of the inner palace. The curse, in their telling, was almost secondary. The injustice was the story. What happened to Choi after her punishment is one of the parts of this story most difficult to reconstruct. The inner palace system did not document the lives of servants in the way it documented the movements of royal consorts or court ladies. What the fragmentary record suggests is that she remained within the palace, in the lowest tier of the servant hierarchy, and continued to work. She was not executed. She was not expelled. In some ways, this was its own form of punishment, to remain in the system that had wronged her, invisible, stripped of whatever small standing she had previously held, surrounded by people who were unwilling to acknowledge publicly what had been done. This kind of institutional isolation, where the wrong party is kept in proximity to their wrongdoers and stripped of the ability to speak, produces a very particular kind of person, quiet, watchful, patient in a way that people who have never experienced a mistake for acceptance. In the 1970s and 1980s, a small number of Thai oral historians began systematically interviewing elderly women who had connections, either directly or through their mothers and grandmothers, to the inner palace system. The project was not focused on Choi specifically. It was an attempt to document an institution that had been formally abolished and was rapidly passing out of living memory. But in interview after interview, a name kept surfacing. Not always Choi specifically, but the story, the wrongly accused servant, the punishment, the letter, the deaths that followed. The details vary between accounts, as details in oral tradition always do. But the emotional architecture of the story remained consistent. A woman was wronged. The system protected those who wronged her, and something afterward did not leave that unaddressed. The historians who compiled these accounts were careful to frame them as cultural testimony rather than verified history. But they published them because they believed the story deserved to be recorded. The Royal Thai Palace has never issued a statement about Choi. This is not surprising. Institutions built on hierarchy and divine authority do not voluntarily discuss their failures, particularly those that occur within systems they have since formally dismantled. The abolition of the non-harm system, the inner palace, came gradually through the early 20th century, with the last vestiges disappearing during the reign of Rama VI. The official narrative presented this as modernization, a willingness to reform. What the women who were interviewed by oral historians described was something different. An institution that had not fundamentally changed its relationship to power, only changed which mechanisms it used to protect that power. The inner palace was gone, but the reflex to close ranks, to keep documents thin, to allow the official silence to stand in place of the truth, that reflex, the women said, did not disappear when the doors were unlocked. Thai academic historians who have written about the inner palace tend to approach Choi's story from one of two directions. The first treats it as a case study in the systemic vulnerabilities of enclosed institutional power, an example of how absolute authority over a sealed community creates conditions in which false accusations become almost structurally inevitable because the accuser faces no consequences and the accused has no recourse. The second approach treats the cultural memory of the curse as significant in its own right, regardless of whether it can be verified against physical events. In this reading, the story of Choi survived and was preserved precisely because it expressed something that could not be said directly within the official historical record, that the palace system had caused harm, that the harm had not been acknowledged, and that the people who lived through it needed a framework for understanding why. The curse, in this reading, is not superstition. It is justice rendered in the only language available. Psychologists who study closed institutional systems, prisons, convents, military facilities, total institutions of all kinds, describe a predictable psychological arc in individuals who are wrongly punished and then confined within the system that punished them. The first stage is protest, an attempt to correct a record, to be heard, to appeal. When this fails, the second stage is withdrawal. The person learns to make themselves functionally invisible, to reduce their profile within the system to the minimum required for survival. But beneath that invisibility, something else develops, a form of internal clarity that people outside the situation rarely achieve. When the ordinary consolation, status, social approval, the hope of future reward are removed, what sometimes remains is a kind of stripped-down certainty about what is real. Choi's letter, by the account of those who have read it, had that quality. It was not written in desperation. It was written with the precision of someone who had nothing left to protect, and therefore nothing left to blur. The identity of the woman who made the original accusation against Choi is one of the more frustrating gaps in this story. The documents that have been referenced by researchers suggest she held a mid-level position within the inner palace hierarchy. Not a royal consort, but not a servant either. A court lady of some standing. The accusation would have carried weight precisely because of that standing. Above Choi, but not so elevated that the accusation would seem politically motivated. The perfect position from which to destroy someone without consequence. Whether the accusation was personal, motivated by jealousy, by a specific conflict between the two women, or whether it was opportunistic, a convenient way to eliminate someone for reasons that had nothing to do with the alleged theft, is not clear from the surviving record. What is clear is that the accuser lived for many years after the accusation. Whether she lived well is a question the historical record does not cleanly answer. There is something about institutional spaces at night that intensifies the weight of what happened in them during the day. The Grand Palace, seen from outside after dark, presents a face of absolute stillness. The tourists are gone. The courtyards are empty. The footsteps and voices that animate the place during the day are withdrawn, and what remains is the architecture itself. Centuries of stone and gold, holding whatever it holds. The women who lived inside during Choi's time would have known the palace at night in a way that no tourist or official visitor ever could. They would have known the sound of it. The particular way sound moved through the servant corridors, the way heat released from the stone floors after sundown, the specific rhythm of the night guard's rounds. They would have known which rooms carried silence and which carried something else. What Choi knew of those nights, in the years after her punishment, belongs to her alone. The archival discovery of what is believed to be Choi's letter or one of its copies, since there's evidence it was transcribed by at least one other person, occurred sometime in the mid-20th century during a review of materials related to the Inner Palace period. The researcher who found it reportedly set aside without full consideration, cataloged it as miscellaneous personal correspondence, and moved on. It was a subsequent reviewer, working through the same collection years later, who recognized its significance. The second researcher was not looking for a curse. She was looking for documentation of informal complaint processes within the Inner Palace, how servants who felt wronged expressed that wrong, even without formal channels. What she found was a document that expressed it in a form that had no institutional category. It was not a complaint. It was not a confession. It was something closer to a reckoning, written by a woman who had decided that if the palace would not give her justice, she would seek it from a source the palace could not govern. Translating Choi's letter is not a simple matter of moving words from one language to another. The Thai of the period, particularly in document produced by or for people of lower court rank, uses registers and idioms that do not map cleanly onto modern Thai, let alone onto other languages. The scholar who produced the most careful translation of the document, working from a photographic copy of what is believed to be the original, spent considerable time on the final section. The closing passage, which contains what people have read as a curse, uses a grammatical construction that in modern Thai carries a particular spiritual connotation, a statement addressed not to a person but to accumulated reality itself. It is closer to a declaration than a request, closer to testimony given to the universe than a prayer offered to a deity. The scholar, in her published commentary, described it as the most precise thing she had read in years of working with historical documents. Precise, she said, not because it was elaborate. Precise because it was exact. Thai royal institutions have mechanisms for not responding to things. This is not unique to Thailand. Most monarchies do. What distinguishes the Thai case is a specific legal framework around discussion of the royal family, which makes public scrutiny of historical events within the palace a matter that requires genuine care from researchers and journalists alike. The result is that Choi's story has circulated primarily through academic channels, oral history collections, and cultural discussions that frame the material in terms of institutional history rather than royal accountability. Whether this is the appropriate framing is a question people inside Thailand debate carefully and in private. What is not debated, at least not among the historians who have examined the record, is whether Choi was wronged. The evidence for that is, by the standards available to historical inquiry, as clear as the evidence gets. The question that remains open is what, if anything, that wrongness set in motion. Choi's story is not singular in its structure. The architecture of it, wrongful accusation, institutional protection of the accuser, sealed system preventing external review, the wrong party's subsequent invisibility within the records, appears in the history of virtually every closed institutional setting ever studied. What makes Choi's case distinct is not the injustice itself. Injustice of this kind was and remains common. What makes it distinct is that someone wrote it down with the full knowledge that writing it down was not going to change anything in the immediate term, and that the writing survived long enough to find readers. Most people in Choi's position are lost to history entirely. Their names do not appear in letters. Their accounts do not surface in archives. They simply disappear into the record of labor performed and lives constrained, unnamed and unremembered. Choi found a way to ensure her name, or at least her story, did not disappear. That act alone, regardless of what came after, represents a form of resistance that deserves recognition on its own terms. Institutions are haunted not by ghosts in the theatrical sense, but by the unresolved weight of what occurred within them. The Grand Palace carries this weight as visibly as any structure in Asia. Its beauty is not incidental to its history. The beauty and the history are the same thing, built from the same source of power, sustained by the same hierarchies. The women of the inner palace contributed to that beauty in ways that the palace's official historical framing rarely acknowledges. They maintained it. They sustained the ceremonial life that animated it. They raised the children who would eventually inherit it. And many of them, not just Choi, but hundreds of women across the decades of the inner palace's operation, experienced within those beautiful walls things that the structure was designed to ensure would never be spoken of. The fact that some of those things are now spoken of is the result not of official generosity, but of precisely the kind of refusal that Choi's letter represents. By the time Choi wrote the final lines of her letter, she understood something that people in positions of power almost never have confronted directly, that the formal mechanisms of justice and the actual experience of justice are, in closed systems, entirely separate things. The formal mechanisms had processed her. They had accepted the accusation, administered the punishment, filed the paperwork, and moved on. The palace had continued to function. The people responsible had continued to live their lives within the hierarchy that protected them. None of this had touched the underlying reality of what had happened, which was that she had been falsely accused and punished, and no one with the power to say so had said so. What she turned to in the final lines of that letter was not resignation. It was an appeal to a form of accounting that existed entirely outside the institution's ability to manage or suppress. She was not asking for revenge. She was asserting that what had happened to her was real, was recorded somewhere that no archivist could reach, and that its weight would not disappear simply because the palace wished it to. Reconsidering the 3 deaths that became associated with Choi's letter requires holding 2 possibilities simultaneously without collapsing into either one. The first possibility is that the deaths were coincidences, that the royal household, like any large institutional family, experienced loss, and that the pattern was imposed retrospectively by people who needed a narrative framework for grief and unresolved guilt. This is a serious possibility, and historians are right to name it. The second possibility is that the deaths were connected not by the supernatural in any literal sense, but by the specific consequences of how power was exercised and protected within the palace system, that decisions made to protect the people who wronged Choi set in motion other decisions, other protections, other suppressions of truth, and that these cascading choices ultimately damaged the very people they were designed to protect. In this reading, the curse is not supernatural at all. It is the natural consequence of sustained institutional dishonesty. It always arrives eventually. The only question is in what form. The formal dissolution of the inner palace system did not happen cleanly or suddenly. It occurred gradually, As Siamese society began engaging more extensively with European institutional models, and as the court's internal justifications for the system weakened under external scrutiny. By the 1920s, the physical structure of the inner palace as an enclosed community of women had effectively ended. Women who had spent decades inside were released into a society that had changed significantly around them. Some had family to return to, others did not. The oral history interviews from the 1970s and 1980s include accounts from women whose grandmothers had been among the last to leave. Elderly women navigating a Bangkok they barely recognize carry with them the entire interior world of an institution that no longer existed anywhere except in memory. What they carry about Choi was part of that interior world, and they passed it carefully, deliberately, to the people who came after them. The researchers who have kept Choi's story alive over the past several decades are not, for the most part, people interested in the supernatural. They are historians, linguists, gender studies scholars, and cultural anthropologists who find in the story of the inner palace one of the most accessible entry points into understanding how Thai institutional power functioned during a critical period of the country's history. Choi specifically interests them because her case is documented, fragmentarily, imperfectly, but documented in ways that many comparable cases are not. The letter exists. The references to the punishment exist. The oral history accounts exist. The deaths are on the official record. Even if the official record is thin, that convergence of sources is rare. And for scholars who spend their careers working with documents that have been deliberately thinned, deliberately vague, deliberately protective of the institution that generated them, the presence of even fragmentary documentation is enough to sustain years of careful inquiry. What remains of Choi is a letter, a name in documents that prefer not to name her, and a story preserved by the women who knew what the documents omitted. What remains of the people who wronged her is harder to say. Their names are in the official record in ways that hers is not. That is what rank does. It ensures its own documentation. But the record that Choi addressed her final lines to is not the official one. It is a record that has no format, no archival category, no climate-controlled storage shelf. It is the record kept by the weight of unresolved things, the accumulation that Thai spiritual tradition understands as having its own momentum, independent of whether anyone in an official capacity acknowledges it. Whether you believe in that kind of record or not, Choi clearly did. And the measured certainty with which she addressed it, a woman who had been stripped of everything else, suggests that her belief was not desperation. It was a considered conclusion, reached after everything else had failed. The archivist who produced the most detailed study of Choi's letter made a quiet observation at the end of her published work. She noted that, across all of the documents she had examined from the Inner Palace period, the proclamations, the registers, the formal correspondence, the ceremonial records, Choi's letter was the only document in collection that appeared to have been read many times. The other documents showed the typical wear of institutional storage, handled a few times, filed, forgotten. The letter was different. Its handling showed repeated contact, multiple readers, across what the archivist estimated was a long period of time. Someone or many people had returned to it, had kept returning to it. She did not speculate on why in the published work, but in an interview conducted after the paper was released, she said quietly that she thought she understood the reason. The letter told the truth, she said, and the truth in that archive was rare enough to draw people back to it again and again, long after the events it described had passed into history. The candle burns, the palace stands, and the letter, wherever it is now, continues to be what was written to be, a record that could not be made to disappear.